Good evening. I'm Catherine Algor, and I'm the president here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Welcome. I hope you're as excited as I am about tonight's program. I'm going to actually give ourselves a little pat on the back. I think this is a great event. We have two accomplished authors who have both published books tackling the historical roots of our current political paralysis, and they're being interviewed by Robin Young, who always asks the right questions. You know, people talk about cultural institutions, especially historical societies, about relevance, and I just can't imagine a more fitting sort of example of how our past is relevant to our present than tonight's program. And this is just one of the great programs that we host. We have seminars and other events, and if you don't have a copy of our calendar, please pick one up on the way out so you can see the programs we have coming, and we've got some good ones coming. I also hope you had a chance to see our small display that we put together for our event today. Thank you, Peter Drummy, as always. And if you missed it, just go back in the room that we had the reception in and take a look at it. And especially with tonight's program, I was thinking how amazing it is to work at a place where the collection, the level of depth is so great that we always can find something to display no matter what the subject is. Now, we create these programs, we mount exhibitions, and make our remarkable collection open to everybody free of charge through the support of our members. So if you enjoy this evening's program and want to see more and you're not a member, I would encourage you to be a member of the Massachusetts Historical Society. So a little housekeeping before we start. I wanted to let you know that we are videotaping the program this evening, and it will be available through our website and the MHS YouTube channel. And I also want to let you know that both books under discussion will be for sale in the lobby afterwards. I now have the privilege of introducing our speakers tonight. Julian Zelizer is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He has authored 8 books as well as editing books with subjects ranging from politics and the media to the presidency of George W. Bush. In addition to his scholarly publications, he is a frequent commentator in the international and national media on political history and contemporary politics. He has published over 700 op-eds, including his weekly column on CNN.com. He is a regular on radio, television, and in print. Michael Tomasky is the editor-in-chief of Democracy, a journal of ideas. He is a columnist, commentator, journalist, and author, including being a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, a columnist for the Daily Beast, and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. He is the author of 4 books, including his most recent, If We Can Keep It, How the Republic Collapsed and How It Might Be Saved. Last, but certainly not least, we have Robin Young, and I'm sure many of us already know her and listen to her. She is the co-host of Here and Now on WBUR and NPR. She's a Peabody Award-winning documentary filmmaker who has also reported for NBC, CBS, and ABC Television, and for several years was the substitute host and correspondent for The Today Show. She has received several Emmy Awards for her television work, as well as a Cable Ace Award and radio's regional Edward R. Murrow Award. So please join me in welcoming our speakers this evening.
It is my pleasure to be here. I love this building, and I love being in this room, so there's that. And then I am such a fan of these two gentlemen. Julian is, we discovered you, Julian. I'm sorry, when you were at Harvard. I reclaim you, and Michael, we just have been following your work for so long. And now you kind of, you meet in these 2 books, which are just terrific, but I warn you, your head will explode. I mean, there's just everything in recent American history in Julian's book from the 70s, and in American history in your book, Michael. And I'm going to skip through of necessity because there's so much. I mean, there you are in 1854 at the birth of the Republican Party in Wisconsin, wholly Northern Party, wholly anti-slavery. There you are at the Abscam scandal. Do you guys remember the Abscam scandal? I mean, we watched these grainy tapes at night of a congressman taking a bribe, and Tom Shales in the Washington Post said it was like political porn, you know, to see this like. So it's all in there, and we can't possibly get to all of it, but let's start with this overarching idea that we agree that we are all going to hell in a handbasket. or two handbaskets, because we're polarized. And the question is, when and why did we embark on this journey to hell in handbaskets, and what to do about it? Michael, if I can just set the parameters here, you write President Trump thrives on division, but he couldn't succeed if there was a mess preceding him, so we'll take that up. And you start your history of this journey in the 1700s. You say, except for two times in American history, America has always been polarized, starting in 1787, as the Constitution was being written. Julian, you put it at 1974. Watergate, Nixon steps down in disgrace, oil embargo, Americans punching each other on a line to get gas, the Vietnam War winding down ignominiously, and divisions like income inequality that already existed become canyons. So that's where your starting points are. Michael, I want to pick it up with you. Go back to the writing of the Constitution and the title of your book.
So, if we can keep it, I'm sure many of you remember where that comes from. It was the last day of the Constitutional Convention, September 17th, 1787, and they emerged from the hall. And a woman says to Benjamin Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have you given us, a republic or a monarchy?" And he says, "Madam, a republic if you can keep it." So I thought that made a very good title, and it was an interesting thing that he said. It was not, he didn't say a republic, congratulations, a republic, go party. He said a republic if you can keep it.
Beginning, the divisions were, the seeds were planted right with the split between Jefferson and Hamilton.
Yeah.
What kind of government, how big, what should it do?
They were divided over exactly the same thing we're divided over today, although we're divided over more things today. But the fundamental divide in today's culture is over the size and scope and power of the federal government, and that was the fundamental divide then as well. I like to say to audiences that our divisions go back to the 90s, the 1790s. So the Hamilton, and they're very uncannily similar to what we see today. The Hamiltonians were the city slickers, the coastal elites, if you will, who believed in a big federal government and in things like the creation of the first national bank, which was the first really big thing I think that the first Congress debated. The Jeffersonians were the backwoods people, the yeoman farmers who distrusted federal government, who didn't want to be taxed. And so these things are extremely, extremely deep in our roots.
Well, but yet you do, where you guys really intersect is there's a line in your book about halfway through. You're at the 60s, the 1960s at this point, and you write, "You wonder why today our politicians can't get along. This is when they and we started not getting along." I want to jump over to Julian, but what did you mean by that?
Well,
given that the seeds were
Yes.
planted at the Constitution.
Well, there came a period in American history when we did kind of get along. Not we, the people. I mean, there are all kinds. There are always roiling issues that are dividing people. But our government, let's say, the people in Washington, the people on Capitol Hill, there was what we call an era of consensus from the war, depression, war, certainly post-war era, into the 1970s. When there was a lot of ideological overlap between the parties and when a lot of contentious things passed on a bipartisan basis, the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare and Medicaid, to name just a few of the several. Then, over the course of the later 1960s, there was fragmentation. So that's what I mean. Over civil rights and race, over gender and cultural politics, over immigration, though that took a little while longer to come to a head, and certainly over the economic issues of the sort that are the primary focus of Julian's
And I do
book.
want to get to Julian in 1 second, but I love, there was one detail about how it was such a concerted effort during the Depression era and right after for Americans to get along, to survive that time. There was a phrase, the American way, and it was sort of became an advertising slogan. I mean, manufacturers got behind putting up billboards
Yes.
to tell people there is a way.
So just at the time when unemployment was 24%, And when most Americans were living in or near poverty, the average wage of 1935 was $1,524, which if you do the math and calculate it to today's dollars, it's just barely above what we consider poverty today. Yet, they were being told that the American way of life is the best way of life. The funny detail that I think you're referring to is I got this from a historian who wrote a great book about it, and she noted that until the 1930s, the phrase the American way never appeared. She found it in 2 books, one of which was titled The American Way of Playing Ukulele Solos.
Which doesn't count. So this was sort of an effort to pull people through that time and define a sort of American way of approaching crises like that. And people did pull together. And so Julian, this is where you start, the post-60s, early 1970s. You say, this is where Americans didn't care about getting along. Up to this time, a robust federal government, thriving post-war middle-class economy, powerful union movement kept sources of division at bay. How so?
Yeah, I mean, the book takes off on the idea, and thank you for everyone for coming. But the argument isn't that Americans got along before the 1970s, but one of the remarkable things in this period between the Depression and the end of the 60s, it's not simply that there were consensus ideas, but that there were a lot of institutions that actually pushed against our divisions. And so one that we talk about in the beginning of the book are unions, which were incredibly important during this period and served as a kind of common workplace organization for many different Americans. It literally helped increase middle-class economic life during this period, which was very important, keeping people invested in the manufacturing economy. The role of the federal government was quite strong, and it was an institution that had power in place during this period. And even institutions such as the media were quite different. During the pre-70s period, you had 3 networks and a handful of city papers, which really provided a common basis before the arguments began. And so our story is, as those fall away, they're not rebuilt with new institutions that will create incentives toward any kind of consensus, just the opposite. And that's why we start that way.
Well, and talk about the media further.
Yeah.
Either of you can pick this up, but
Yeah.
I think, Michael, it's you who writes about the 1971 Lewis Powell, the Powell memo. Lewis Powell, before he was appointed to Nixon's Supreme Court, he was asked to write this letter by a friend who I think was running the Chamber of Commerce at the time, and this was after all the ruptures of the 60s, the fights over racial equality, women's equality, the Vietnam War, all of this. There's sort of the backwash happening in the 70s, and there had been, some would say, a feeling of great success on the part of young people in particular who had fomented a lot of the revolutions of the 60s. And so this man who ran the Chamber of Commerce asked his neighbor, Lewis Powell, can you write something? And he wrote this 1,000-page, or was it 1,000-page?
No, it's a few thousand words.
Yeah.
Few thousand-word letter encouraging people how to counter the counter-revolutionary forces of the 60s. So apparently this letter, which told people to fund conservative scholars, get on campuses, evaluate textbooks, monitor the media. It's what inspired Richard Coors, the conservative, to fund something called the Heritage Foundation, which started up a couple years later. Charles Koch to fund it's where it all started. It's when Roger Ailes and others decided, let's start another network. We're never going to have what happened with the Washington Post and Nixon. That's never going to happen again to us. Talk about that moment in history. You can.
I mean, look, the conservative movement is the most important story, I would argue, other than the collapse of the manufacturing-based economy in the 1970s. The two go hand in hand. So an economy based in states like Michigan are really starting to struggle with the energy crisis, with the competition from countries such as Japan, and many people are losing the faith that they had in what had been called the era of grand expectations that came before. Jim Patterson called it that, because the economy kept growing until that time. And then you have this movement taking form, and the movement had different parts. Some of it was about the moral majority and evangelical Christians mobilizing politically and focusing on issues like the ERA and abortion. But part of it was a business mobilization. And the Powell document's very famous because he's basically outlining this idea that business can't just sit back as this new decade begins. They have to really be proactive, from going on to college campuses to funding institutes. And this was an idea that a lot of conservatives actually had. And the media is one area they're very concerned about. There are a lot of conservatives who feel that old media I talked about was biased toward liberals. It looked objective. It looked like it was just providing facts. But the argument of everyone from a Powell to a Patrick Buchanan was they don't represent the views of us, of this silent majority. So part of the project in the 70s into the 80s is to create a new information ecosystem. And Roger Ailes is already at work by the late 60s into the 70s thinking about this. There's a guy named Reese Schoenfeld who's creating these independent TV networks that lean to the right, and he will eventually be part of the creation of CNN. And there's a kind of effort by some conservatives to go after the fairness doctrine, which will come to an end in 1987. And this was an FCC rule that radio shows and TV shows had to present both sides if you were going to go heavy on a political issue. So the kind of importance of information, news, journalism is at the heart of this conservative mobilization.
You know, Michael, you write, given that, you write such an interesting thing about one moment, or a moment in time, when in fact, you know, many Christian organizations, Baptist groups, were, for instance, not as publicly worked up about choice.
Right.
What happened?
That developed over the course of the decade. That developed over the course of the 70s. The first issue that really got evangelicals, Southern evangelicals, into politics was education and segregation and you know, well, to put it bluntly, the fact that their kids had to go to school with black kids. And that's when the segregated academies started throughout the South. After Brown v. Board, but actually down south after Brown v. Board, nobody actually did anything. Then after a while, into the 60s, it started to be enforced a little bit more, and that's when the segregated academies came into being. And then in the 70s, Nixon surprisingly integrated these academies, and that's what made them political. That's what politicized them in the first place, not abortion. That happened over the course of the 70s. I went and looked at the New York Times' coverage of Roe v. Wade, and it's in the book. First of all, it was the second story of the day, because the same day that the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade, Lyndon Johnson died. But if you look at the New York Times front page for that day, they're both 6 banner headlines. Lyndon Johnson dies. Supreme Court finds abortion right in 14th Amendment. But the sidebar story that reported on the reactions to Roe v. Wade did not quote any Southern evangelical, nobody from the Southern Baptist Convention. It quoted Terence Cardinal Cook, as they were called in those days, with Cardinal as their middle name, and the woman who was the head of the Bronx Right to Life chapter. Abortion wasn't a Southern evangelical Baptist issue until the late 70s, I think.
Yeah. I want to jump ahead, because there's an elephant in the room when we talk about polarization, and it's, and I'm not calling our sitting president an elephant. Nobody tweet that out. But we're talking about polarization and how it came up and has been part of America's identity for centuries. And what I hear from young people in particular today is it can't ever have been worse than it is now. And then I will say things like, well, in, you know, Kent State, a friend of mine was shot and killed at Kent State when a president sent troops on protesting students. Jeffrey Miller, who's the young man on the ground, was my principal's son. And they can't, I mean, they just can't wrap their brains around that. They think this is the most divided right now that this country's ever been. What would you say? Michael, start with you.
Well, we did have a war. a civil war. I guess that was worse.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't quite gotten to the point where a member of the House of Representatives is cane whipping a senator on the floor of the Senate. And incidentally, his...
That was in the late 1800s.
We're getting
Yeah,
close.
yeah, we might get there, yeah. But incidentally, that was when, that of course was Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, who was caned, and Preston Brooks, the congressman from South Carolina, who beat him, as other Southerners stood and held back people who wanted to intervene and stop the beating. And then, perhaps not America's first instance, but an early instance of fake news, the Southern papers reporting that Sumner's injuries were faked.
But what would you, I mean, I want to go back to,
Yeah.
I do want to go to some of the fault lines and some of the other reasons you think we've come to the place we are. It wasn't born here. But what do you say to that when you think of the 60s and you think of the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, look, I usually go to the Civil War, I go to 1968 just to remind a young person that it gets really bad. And we're constantly in periods of deep division and deep discord. And, you know, I don't know in the end when I get that question what you're weighing or what the person wants from that. What's the satisfaction that they're hoping comes out of it. I think the answer, certainly, given we had a civil war, is yes, we have been even worse. The Republic broke down, literally broke down. Does that mean that the divisions we have today are not very debilitating? Or the way that dysfunction and division plays out in our political processes are not deeply troubling and dangerous to solving basic problems? They're still very bad. And so for me, I always want to understand a period on its own terms, and that's where I go with that kind of question. Yeah. It usually is not very satisfying to the student.
Well, let's go back to some of the other reasons that you feel we've come to where we are today. Start with the way we've decided to vote, the winner-take-all system. Talk about the seeds there.
Sure, it has something to do with our polarization, I think. Now, I should stipulate before I put too much weight on this that there are other countries that have other systems of government. Germany has a parliamentary system, and they have a multi-party system. They're pretty polarized too. I mean, we're polarized over substantive things. However, I do use the first chapter of the book to talk about how we came to use single-member districts rather than multi-member districts or at-large elections. And at-large elections, incidentally, were legal in America. This was not in the Constitution. Massachusetts, in fact, was one of the states that used at-large elections in the early days of the Republic. And at-large elections weren't outlawed, really, until finally 1970. How much difference did this make? Well, single-member districts lead to two-party systems. That's a law of political science by this guy named Duverger, and some of you know who he was. And it has created it's allowed for a couple of things. It's allowed for these intensely gerrymandered districts to come into being, and that governed so much of what we're experiencing now. And there are a lot of people who talk about electoral reforms who would like to do away with single-member districts, or at least allow another method of electing members of Congress from multi-member districts with ranked choice voting, or at large from smaller states, that might have an impact in the sense of electing people who are a little bit more moderate and aren't just from these intensely gerrymandered districts where all they have to worry about is maximizing the turnout of their
Just
party.
talk a little more about that. In other words, you'd have slates, so you could pick first, second, third, and how does that change things?
Yeah, well, Maine did that this year, and they had ranked choice voting, and they elected their member of Congress that way. It's complicated to explain in a couple of minutes, but the main thing is that one of our big problems right now is these intensely gerrymandered districts, where a Republican doesn't have to get any Democratic votes, or a Democrat doesn't have to get any Republican votes. If you had multi-member districts, a lot of people say, or at least around the margins, you could elect people who have to worry about getting votes from the middle or from the other side.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Michael's talking about, there's two ways to think about the problem. There's big structural parts of American government and society that perpetually create the seeds and possibility and instruments of division. A lot of the early part of your book is good. It kind of stresses the way in which minority rule is institutionalized in the mechanisms of government, the Electoral College and the Senate, and perpetuate, or always have the potential to perpetuate the division. And then there is a period-specific focus of what goes on in a few decades that really kind of brings these out. And so for me, the mechanisms are crucial, but one of the interesting phenomenon of this post-70s period, for example, is the way the new Republican Party that emerges in the aftermath of the 1960s often really tries to capitalize and play on these mechanisms to secure its power and to actually use polarization as an instrument of a political strategy. Agnew talks in the Nixon's vice president about, he explicitly says polarization is something that we can use to our advantage, and we have to divide and capitalize on that. And that means you only have to win basically a majority plus a little bit more. And so the story of the conservative movement is that. And now we see it playing out, the way in which redistricting is used politically by the GOP, or the way in which the Senate has become a bastion in some ways of conservative power, even as the nation changes dramatically.
What about parties themselves? And forgive me, because
Yeah.
your books have sort of done a mashup for
Yeah.
me, so I'm not sure which one of you wrote this. But at one point, FDR made secret attempts to work with Wendell Willkie, and was this you? And he was actually thinking that maybe they could get the liberals of both parties together to go form another party.
Yeah. I mean, well, you can.
No, go ahead.
I mean, look, the parties changed in the period of the 1920s to the 70s, and you alluded to this earlier. The parties were divided and fragmented. There was overlap. You had conservative Southern Democrats, and you had Midwestern Republicans. So the conservative coalition, it was called in Congress, was a big force. And then you had liberal Northeasterners in the GOP, and you had a very powerful liberal wing in the Democratic Party, people like Hubert Humphrey. And so those kinds of either alliances between the parties or even discussions about forming some kind of alternative party made sense. The parties changed very much. Part of it after the 70s is what's called the sorting of the electorate. The Southerners become Republicans. The Northeastern liberal Republicans disappear altogether. So both parties are much more on the same page. And layered onto that are these reforms that take place in the 70s, where reformers purposely tried to make politics more partisan. Yeah. The idea was partisanship was good. They were tired of the backroom bipartisan alliances that held up progress on everything. And reformers in the 70s said we need a more partisan Washington, that if the party stood for something, voters would have a choice, they would get things done. And so they pass all these reforms and change the way business is done so that the party leaders were much stronger in Washington. So those two converge, and there's very little overlap anymore. And those kinds of alliances are almost impossible, as President Obama learned.
I just want to say there might be some Northeastern Republicans still in this room.
That's
actually.
it, though,
and
right.
so we just want to have said that.
We're here.
We just want to have said that. But jump in. You seem like, did you want to jump in there?
Well, sure. I mean, you started with FDR, and that's an interesting little anecdote. So compared to Europe, in the 19th century, as the countries of Europe cast off monarchy and became democratic republics, parties formed in those countries, of course, but they were largely formed along coherent ideological lines. In England, there was the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. The Labour came later in the 1920s. And Germany had Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, and all the other countries fell into line. We never had that in this country, and I think that's a very important thing to understand. We didn't have ideologically coherent parties. We had parties that were these strange amalgams and that tried to paper over slavery, for example. So I talk a lot in my book about Martin Van Buren, who you probably don't think is very important, but he actually is an important figure in this history, and he was essentially the founder of the Democratic Party. And he designed the Democratic Party in the 1820s to be a party that would join the planters of the South and the plain Republicans of the North, as was his phrase. So they papered over slavery. They papered over this. They papered over that. Then as the country grew and added states, they had to make these weird coalitions, and they didn't really have that much in common in a lot of ways. And so that's what our party inheritance was into the 20th century. This bothered Roosevelt to enough of an extent that he did indeed go to Wilkie and say, Wendell, we need a liberal party and a conservative party, because he was having a lot of trouble in Congress with his conservative wing, right? We need a liberal party and a conservative party. And, you know, Wilkie agreed, and Wilkie was on Roosevelt's side, slightly ironically, since Roosevelt had just clobbered him in the election, but they were on the same side, and but Roosevelt had a war to fight and failing health, and he never got around to it.
But you know, picking up on that, how partisan and politicized the parties themselves have become.
Yeah.
Eric Waken, is that how you pronounce his name? Who wrote the review of your book? By the way,
yeah.
your book with Kevin Cruz.
Yeah.
In the New York Times.
Yeah.
You know where I'm going here. He says, well, actually, research shows that it is the political parties that are polarized, not the people. Called it party sorting. You were referencing that. You've got two separate groups with ideological and policy conformity that don't overlap at all, you know, as opposed to, as you said, back in the time when you could have had a Rockefeller and a conservative Democrat like Zell Miller. And so then those parties, it gets much easier for them. It's very tunnel vision. They just have to cater to the cable channel that they want, and the people who are as hard-nosed, and they can, you know, work that line to victory, and they don't have to pay attention to other Americans. But he says the majority of Americans don't have uniformly conservative or liberal views, according to research. Do you think that's true? Because it feels to me, and maybe because I'm in this bubble of media, and so I'm hearing from partisans all the time, it feels to me like it is the American populace that is also polarized, not just the parties.
It's true and it's not true. That's what a historian always answers. So that's my job. It's all true. Look, the sorting of voters happened. It's empirical. And if you go to the South today, it's generally Republican territory. It's changing a little bit now, but for decades it's been that way since the mid-'80s. Really, that Southern vote locks in for the GOP. And even if there are some in this room, by and large, the Northeastern Republican presence is not the same in the vote, not just in the leadership. So that kind of sorting is true. There are pretty fundamental divisions that you can find in polling on some very important political questions. It's also true that pollsters, there was a political scientist at Harvard, Mo Fiorina, who did a book on this, and showed that if you ask questions in different ways, there's a fuzziness in the electorate. You might find potential compromise on a question like reproductive rights. It's not quite as stark as you might think. So the electorate is divided, but there's potential areas of commonality. But the politics, and we actually don't disagree with that in the review. That's the point. Our institutions, from media institutions to political institutions, are working in a way where the incentives are not to even try to find that. Because if you are a member of the House of Representatives and you're looking at a district that's solidly red, why would you possibly try to look for a policy position that is in the middle? If you're dealing with a media system which since the mid-'90s is, you know, kind of partisan outlets have a lot of weight, not just on television, but on the internet, why would you send out messages that will get you absolutely no airtime?
And if you knew that that's the only district that you needed, I mean, you go back to the Electoral College, if you knew that that's the only district you needed, why do you care that there might be a district that might be fuzzier if you don't need them? But then explain to me the thing that I saw when I was on the trail, the campaign trail, a lot was I'd meet young men in particular who were trying to decide between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And then you hear from, and we know that there were so many people who voted for Obama who then voted for Trump. That doesn't sound, you know, it doesn't sound partisan and polarized.
Well, I mean, within each party you can have frustration with the leadership. I would be hesitant to take the flippers of 2016, the people who had voted for Obama in 2008 at the height of an economic crisis, some of whom had been Republican before, and then go to Trump as indicative of a more dynamic or flexible electorate. But clearly, the Democratic Party, this is an important part of the story, has remained much more ideologically factionalized than the Republican Party. So you do tend to find more pronounced divisions, as you saw in that primary, until recently, where the Republicans have lined up. And even though Trump is an outlier, it's pretty remarkable and clear to me that the Republican Party has remained pretty much on the same page, even as the president does some of the most outrageous and often kind of challenging things to the party orthodoxy.
Talk about the intra-party disagreements right now. And I do want to get to your list of how to maybe make things better. Because, Julian, you don't sound as hopeful that things
No,
can
we don't have a list like that.
Yeah, you don't sound, but I know you...
And I don't believe my lists either.
Right.
So.
But I know you'll jump in on it as
Yeah.
well. But where was I going with that? Where was I going with that?
The intra-party.
Oh, yeah, the intra-party. Talk about present day, because the buzzword now is democratic socialist. And is the Democratic Party, because it does allow these differences of opinion, is it going to be cannibalized by the incoming, the freshman congressmen and women in particular, who are not hesitating to say, Medicare for all, which may be a wonderful thing, but right now, when maybe your bigger effort should be towards ensuring that President Trump doesn't have another a term if you are a Democrat, is that the best thing to do? You talk a little bit about that.
Sure. First of all, with respect to this new class in the House of Representatives, I think it's worth remembering that more of them actually joined the new Democratic and Blue Dog coalitions than joined the Progressive Caucus, numerically. Yeah. A few more. Not that many more, but a few more. Which neither pleases me nor displeases me. I'm just reporting it to you as a fact. But you would never know that from reading the papers and watching cable news, because AOC is the only person who gets attention, and Ilhan
Note to
Omar,
myself,
when she
report
says,
tomorrow
yeah.
on how, I'm sorry, I have not reported that.
Right,
Yeah.
well, yeah, check it out.
But what's taking the oxygen out of the room is Kamala Harris saying, let's just get rid of the
Saying, let's get
insurance
rid of the
industry.
private insurers.
And not understanding that most Americans don't understand the difference between a democratic socialist and a Marxist socialist and a
Right.
Venezuelan socialist.
Right, and and they're not going to, but my point is that the Democratic Party, as it currently exists in Congress, has moved a little to the left, but I would say on balance only a little. Now, the presidential candidates are moving a little bit more dramatically to the left, because someone like Kamala Harris, who has not a left-wing record as California's Attorney General, said that. But, we'll just see what happens over the course of the presidential campaign. I mean, as Robin alluded, it looks like from polls the main thing Democrats want to do is win. And we'll see what happens. We're a long way away from anybody casting a vote or raising their hand at a caucus meeting. Right. A long way away from it, and we'll just see what happens. And there are going to be 8 million polls between now and then. And if the polls in a year from now are saying that Bernie Sanders has the best chance of beating Donald Trump, people will vote for Bernie Sanders. And if the polls say that it's Beto O'Rourke if he gets in, or
Joe
Biden, people will probably vote for them. I think electability is going to be the main thing. Probably.
I mean, remember, the Republicans they had the radicalism for me was on the Republican side. And so everyone talks about the Green New Deal as too radical, and the discussion of isn't climate change denialism, which is now swept through the entire Republican Party at high levels. And the party has survived politically so far. So part of me says, well, if the Republicans can do it, why is it such a problem for the Democrats to have some kind of vociferous, excited new voices? The other part is, even though the Democrats are not quite as much on the same page as the GOP, the party and its mechanisms are still strong. And so everyone, when the election happened, was asking me, I remember, is Nancy Pelosi gone? Are they gone? And in the end, she had a lot of tools to come back and make sure everyone was disciplined. I think most members are already kind of falling into the party line. Bernie Sanders lost to Hillary Clinton. We have to remember that. And so the party mechanisms worked there. So the same kind of partisanship we've been talking about has the potential, I think, to still contain this. And a party can use kind of exciting, fresh voices to its advantage. It only is destructive if those voices totally debilitate the ability of the party to win elections or to move forward with an agenda. But smart party leaders use that. They use it to excite new voters. They use it to put ideas on the table. And I can still imagine Speaker Pelosi kind of doing that. I know there's tensions with her and AOC, but she's a pretty savvy leader, and I could imagine her harnessing this. So I don't think the party's in a state of crisis or anything.
I'm sorry for my editorial comment there, banging my head on the microphone, but when you said climate change, you made me think of the news today that there's an executive order to start a new panel, which will be headed by Hatter from the Security Council, who's the Princeton-educated physicist who believes that emissions are actually good for the planet. They're healthy for plants, and he's going to be heading up this new White House panel on climate change. I'm sorry. So.
That's radical. That's that's
that
far
is
out.
Radical.
That's far out.
That is radical.
Right.
I mean, we react more to an AOC than we might to that panel, but that's pretty radical.
We react more, and I think, and I don't know where everyone else is, but I do think that's part of the power of the conservative media, which is, in my mind, more powerful than what liberals have at their disposal. It's very good at getting a coordinated message out, and there's more kind of working between the parties and the networks, the Republican Party and Fox News, and you see this with President Trump. And part of why that narrative takes hold is it's been just an onslaught on socialism taking over, radicalism taking over, and they take an issue like this Green New Deal platform and say, see, Marxism is here.
Yeah.
Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, and to a lesser extent, Laura Ingraham and Lou Dobbs are the chair people of the Republican Party today.
Yeah,
they
no
functionally
question.
are.
And you talk about a point in history, you both do, when suddenly we talked about what was happening in the 70s in this concerted effort to build foundations for this new conservative media, that suddenly people on the left turned around about 10 years later, and they were being outspent, what, 6-1 or something?
It was about that. It was, and it was more than 10 years later. It was like 25 years later.
Yeah. So what to do? We've talked about the voting a little bit and how you might change that, introduce ranked choice voting, bring back at-large congressional elections, get rid of this whole notion of winner-take-all. Get rid of the Electoral College or make it obey the popular vote. How do you make the Electoral College? How do you do that?
Well, there's a movement afoot to do that. It's called the National Popular Vote Movement, and it requires state legislatures, to pass legislation that would say just that would say that, whoever wins the popular vote in our state will
You could do it at the state level?
Yeah, we'll get our electoral votes. Now, obviously, a lot of Republican-dominated states
Wyoming
aren't entirely enthusiastic about doing this. So it's a slow process. But a number of states have done it. Do you know the number?
I don't know.
17, it's something
like
13,
that,
14. So it's getting there. And then at least the winner of the popular vote would win the presidential election, which would have many ramifications even for how people campaign and even for how people govern, which we probably don't have time to get into, but they're interesting topics if you feel like
Well, what
looking
do
at
you say then to people in the smaller states for whom the Electoral College was set up? Then we're not represented.
Well, that's the problem with reform. You have to take things away from people because you're changing a system that benefits the status quo. And what you say is you'll get a better political system overall, that if you care about dysfunction, if you care about a system that fundamentally can't deal with issues that you care about and people in other states care about, or if you have a democracy that's getting so ugly it's impossible to even watch anymore, you make the argument this is going to be part of the deal. And there's other reforms that would probably be less palatable to northeastern states or more populous states. And I don't have an answer. I'm not a politician, nor do I have a prescription, but I think that's the kind of deal making that reform entails. That was a story of the 70s. It is a period of institutional reform. It's one of the most interesting parts of that decade, in part because of Nixon, in part because of the aftermath of Watergate. People took seriously, how do you make the political process better? We reformed the campaign finance system pretty significantly in 74. We created an independent prosecutor in 78, which lasted until Clinton was out of office. We created ethics reforms. Process really mattered. And I think that's a conversation, if we're serious, that we have to get back to. It didn't all work out well. It had unintended consequences. There were limits to what we achieved. But you have to get back to the mechanisms that your book talks about and that have been at play in our book if you're really going to have a discussion. It's not going to be the next president that's bringing civility. I'll bet everything on that, whoever it is.
Yeah, okay. Revive, this is again on your bullet points of how to get rid of polarization. Revive moderate republicanism. Now, short of bringing back my parents and Nelson Rockefeller.
Right. And Edward Brooke, since we're in Massachusetts.
How do you do that?
People always laugh when that phrase comes up at my book talks. So you should feel free. Well, here's what I mean. At the beginning of this hour, Julian used the word incentives. We have an incentive structure that's perverse. Can we change the incentive structure for Republican politicians so that they behave differently in the House of Representatives? And I guess to some extent for some Democratic politicians, but it's really Republican politicians. So here's what I mean. And I tell this through a story using Barney Frank. And this was an interview that he gave to New York Magazine when he was leaving Congress in about 2000. I guess it was after the 2012 election. And the person from New York Magazine asked him all this stuff about why don't you people get along and compromise. He said, yeah, my constituents ask me that all the time. He said, and I look at them and I say, exactly how much compromising with Michelle Bachmann would you have me do? And they say, gee, you mean they're all Michelle Bachmann? He says, no, half of them are Michelle Bachmann. Half of them are terrified of being primaried by Michelle Bachmann. And that's the problem right there. Because if you're a member of Congress, Republican member of Congress, from one of these red districts in the South or the Midwest, where you only need to maximize the Republican vote and you don't have to worry about getting any swing votes or moderate or independent votes, you will not cast a vote. It's not so much its operation now that there's a Republican president, but when Obama was a president, if you voted for an Obama judge or voted for an Obama initiative of any major kind, boom, you had a primary. And you had a well-financed primary, because there are these groups like Club for Growth and others that finance these primaries. And there are always 4 or 5 people in these districts waiting to run who are more right-wing than the guy who's there, believe it or not. That is a problem. That's what needs to be changed. So what I say in the book, no, there's never going to be another Edward Brooke. There's never going to be another Jacob Javits. There's never going to be another Charles Mathias. But you might get, if somebody organizes to oppose the Club for Growth, if you have a Club for Growth of the center in the Republican Party, that takes a lot of money and a lot of organization and a lot of sticking to it over the course of 15 or 20 years. I said in an earlier talk, if Howard Schultz wants to spend $300 million in a way that's not completely wasted, that's what he should spend it on. Yeah. And if somebody in the Republican Party fears a primary from the center, or God forbid, fears a general election, then maybe they'll compromise.
I think the other thing that can create that incentive, and it doesn't happen anymore very often, is a total electoral disaster for the Republicans. So, part of how Ronald Reagan starts to gain traction in the 70s, he challenges Ford in 76 in the primaries and almost wins, and then in 1980 he wins, is Republicans are really desperate to rebuild the party. After Goldwater, they had been desperate, but then many of them moved to the center, or they stayed in the center. But after Watergate, many didn't know what was going to happen to the party, and that created an opportunity for a new kind of Republican to move up, and it was right-wing Republicanism. So that's the only other scenario I could imagine, if, including our current administration, if this just unfolds really badly, and Republicans are all of a sudden looking at a period of being a permanent minority, then I think all of a sudden maybe a John Kasich or, you know, those kind of voices. He's
or
pretty
a certain
conservative.
governor from Massachusetts.
But that they could, right.
Yeah.
Well, that they would gain more. But you need partisanship is the solution too. Meaning the same partisan interests that keep the Republicans moving in one direction will turn if things go really poorly. And that's where space could open up for new kinds of voices, combined with real reforms and, you know, money sources to make it happen.
And by the way, we're going to open up the floor, correct, in a few minutes for questions from people there. But I just want to, so get them ready. But I just want to go through a little bit more of this list. You say also insist on a left that doesn't contribute to the fracture. I've been feeling that a lot. Like, you know, we have, on Wednesdays, we have political strategists. And I found myself saying to the strategist from the left, Jamal Simmons, the other day, but wait, didn't your mother say just because they said it, you don't have, oh, it was about lying. It was about lying, and it was about McCabe lying. And I was making the point that, you know, I can see people on the right saying, but Andrew McCabe lied. He lied about whether or not he helped leak information about Hillary Clinton to the Wall Street Journal. I mean, that should count. I mean, it should count. He said, yeah, well, Donald Trump lies. And I felt like I was talking to a 10-year-old. Well, just because one person does it doesn't mean that the other person does it. You know, isn't there a little bit of that, too? You have to, you know.
There is. I mean, I don't know. So that particular conversation to me would move me to a non-government problem, and that's how some of the media works. I'm talking with two great journalists, but there's obviously a whole world of media, partly cable, partly Twitter and social media sites, which now have a bigger news function, which are kind of, they give platforms to that kind of discussion in both parties and that kind of atmosphere. And you're going to need some brave entrepreneurs in the media who take some risks in providing new kinds of news information. I always point to someone, Ezra Klein, who starts this thing called Vox, which is like, what's that? And he's trying to do policy-based journalism, but not just himself. What was interesting is he sets up this whole operation, which a lot of young people love, and they listen to the podcast. And I think the media is actually going to, it has to be part of the solution, because that's where what you're talking about is expressed.
Okay, I do want to get to these last things, but I have to ask you both. And I just get really proud, you know, when I see you on CNN. And, you know, I know that this is where you go to have these discussions. But do you think CNN is making a mistake in getting way too, pugilistic? There's something, it's just kind of off-putting, a tone, a sense of we are going to do this 24 hours a day, this combative us v them. Thoughts?
Yeah, you know, I mean, well, where I thought you were going actually was in hiring Sarah Isgur Flores to direct their presidential campaign coverage. Yes, that's a big mistake.
Let me explain.
I mean, yeah. So she was Jeff Sessions' spokeswoman in the Justice Department. She was Carly Fiorina's spokeswoman on the campaign before that. And, you know, she has zero journalistic experience. Now, hire somebody like that as a talking head, fine. Even try them out as a correspondent if you want. But directing your campaign coverage, it seems that the
What do you think? Why do you think they're doing that?
Because to keep Trump off their back.
Yeah.
What could the other, what there can't
But on
be
the
any-
other hand,
can't possibly be any other
they're
explanation.
provoking every second. It just feels like the tone is. Anyway,
Yeah.
you say, speaking of tone, one of the things that we should start doing is establish foreign interstate college student exchange programs between blue and red states.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, I say that.
Yes.
Yeah,
I said that.
I have no
Well, I mean this. So I use the word foreign metaphorically there, of course.
But
like,
it's not too far.
Yeah, but it's not that far off. I mean, so after the Second World War, we started all these exchange programs around the world, these global student exchange programs, because the world was shrinking and it was the age of the United Nations, and to get to know one another and to foster comity and unity and the brotherhood of man and all that stuff. Well, it seems to me maybe we need to do that in the United States today.
I think you're so spot on.
Yeah.
I mean,
can I just jump in for a second? On that and the other issue, I do want to say something. I mean, I think that's a great idea. I mean, we're talking about big macro reforms and big changes. You change the way a small exchange program where real people, like a Teach for America kind of model, where kids are working in states that are antithetical maybe to their own communities and politics would be wonderful. I mean, that's the great thing about teaching at a college, when you have the ability to foster those kinds of conversations, and you can see students grow in unusual ways. On cable, I mean, I just think the whole world of news, it has great things, and any network has great people working on it and exciting, smart voices, and it has bad things. And some of it is partisanship. I think a lot of our news changed in the 80s to a more commercial focus. I mean, it became a system where networks need ratings. It's replicated on the internet, clickbait headlines on all the major newspapers, where the wrong incentives can drive certain stories, to social media, which likes is the kind of commodity of choice for people who do Twitter. And so we have the wrong incentives there too. And I think some of the problems you talk about maybe on CNN, on MSNBC, any of these channels, we have to step back and have a bigger conversation. But then it does fuel this kind of approach to news.
Well, I kind of expect MSNBC to be more, declaratively from the left.
Yeah.
Although I will say, I think Rachel Maddow is the best reporter and distiller of information in a straightforward way around. But I don't know why I expect CNN to have less of that tone of. It's just something about the tone. But speaking of this kind of cross-cultural almost. Yeah. Bringing people together. You guys might remember the piece in the Boston Globe a while back, and we did a story on them in a town in western Massachusetts. You're nodding after the Trump election, realizing we are not meeting these people. Who are these people that voted for this person? This is unimaginable to us. And so they started a sort of a cross-pollination with people from Kentucky. And they invited this group from Kentucky that was petrified to come to western Massachusetts. Petrified. And they didn't even eat the same food. And yet they've struck up, like 20 people sat in a living room in western Massachusetts, and then they went down to Kentucky and they sat there. And they said, first, this was amazing. The people from Kentucky, help me with this, make sure I've got this right. The people from Kentucky didn't really understand the Holocaust survivors or people whose parents had. They didn't really understand that, and maybe we're kind of inclined to think maybe that wasn't that true, and maybe that isn't really that big a deal. Yeah. They came away shattered by what they learned from the first Jewish people they'd ever met. And these are cosmopolitan towns. These aren't. And then the people from western Massachusetts really understood what it was like to be from a steel town for generations, and the jobs were gone. Mm-hmm. Now that's teeny.
Yeah.
But it was big. It was huge. For each of them, it was huge.
Well,
I mean, I would add, though, you're talking about kind of mixing different social groups in some ways. And the other thing that has to happen, I think, for younger people is investing them more in civic life. I mean, part of what you've seen is a decline of the connection to civic institutions, the idea that government is a bad thing. And if a generation isn't invested in the democratic process and in democratic institutions, of course they're going to be fine, or they'll at least sit passively when those institutions aren't working. They're distant to them. Yeah. And so you also need programs, and some schools have this, but you need students working and having encounters with real kind of government and civic life, whether through internships, whether through meetings with people. I often bring members of Congress to my classes. I brought Barney Frank once. I bring whoever's passing through Princeton, and the bell tolls. And but one of the most remarkable things is they're just shocked to meet them because they're so human. And they're so unlike the caricature that they have of them. And it's always a great hour, and you need more work like that to change this, because if the institutions are remote.
I'll never forget, I was working in Washington, D.C., and had the same impression of D.C. at the time. It was in the mid-90s. And I saw Newt Gingrich it was like a kind of a cocktail kind of gathering, and I saw Newt Gingrich laughing with Ted Kennedy. And I actually got kind of angry. I did, because I said, you've hurt us so much. You know, the populace has been hurt so much, and this was to Newt Gingrich in particular, who pronounced Republicans have to get nastier. And then you are actually friends, but then you go on cable TV or Fox News and you speak about people in this way. That's not fair, because the American people don't know that. Maybe you're kidding. Look, there's so much we could still talk about. You say make national huge corporations do the same thing, have cross-cultural things with their employees, send them to places they may not already go, make the fourth year of college a service year. Ways to try to heal some of these wounds. The books, again, Fault Lines, Julian Zelizer. If we can keep it, Michael Tomasky, Julian's book with Kevin Cruz. I know you have questions, but just for this moment, let's pause and thank these two incredible historian journalists.
Thank you.
And I know there are so many historians here who want to just geek out on this opportunity to speak with them. So, questions? There's a microphone right there. If not, we can continue. Yes, here comes one.
There we go.
I just have to say, this is not a plant, but we went to the same high school. Okay.
We won't say who's older.
Yes, we will. Me. Okay, go ahead.
How much does race play a factor in the politics, the recent politics, I'm thinking between the court cases and the what I would view as restricting voting rights for African Americans? And is it a problem, and two, how do you fix it? Thank you.
Yeah. Well,
I'll set it up. I mean, it's a massive problem, and it has been a problem since the 70s. Kevin and I write about two forms of racial division. One, the institutional racism that is in our electoral system, in our criminal justice system, which is on the table in the 70s and which is never really addressed, and in many ways has been exacerbated in recent decades. And at the same time, this new emergence or an even stronger incarnation of active racism with white nationalist groups, which since the mid-90s, the Oklahoma City bombing time, has been increasing. And those two things are very much on the table in American society. That's not an area I think we want kind of consensual resolution. I think there needs to be a resolution with one side kind of claiming victory, but it plays directly, I think, into some of the voting rights questions that are on the table now, too.
it's the central question of American history, going back to the very, very beginning. You know, on some level, everything is traceable to race in this country. Everything. There have been times when it's gotten better. You know, Ronald Reagan, of all people, maybe not the favorite president of, if we took a straw poll in this room, but a big supporter of the Voting Rights Act, and you know, gave a speech when he signed a renewal of the Voting Rights Act in 1982 that if you went back and read, you'd be very happy to read it and wish that we had a Republican president like that today. There have been moments of like that, but it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. The Supreme Court's going to make it a lot worse over the next few years.
I wanted to ask you about term limits and what role you think that plays, but just before that, I wanted to follow up with Robin, because it was disturbing about the Kentucky folks not knowing about the Holocaust. And I checked myself. I just looked up. There was a recent study that German school kids from 14 to 16, less than 60% of them knew what Auschwitz was. And that's in Germany. I mean, that's...
Well,
Kentucky's one thing, but Germany's another thing.
well, and we know that this far-right movement is really taking hold across Europe.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
not that, I think there are problems. I mean, I think that's something that we are all trying to keep an eye on.
Yeah. But would you comment on what role, if any, you think term limits, when you talk about, the divide and so forth, given the advantage in terms of fundraising and electability of an incumbent, and given the power of seniority in Congress, what role should we be analyzing term limits?
I'm never a big supporter of term limits, and I think it moves in the wrong direction, meaning I think you need people who are more committed to government and more committed to government positions. That was a virtue of the Lyndon Johnson era, which I wrote about. It wasn't simply that there was a magical consensus. People literally worked together over long periods of time. Even if they hated each other, they knew how the process worked, they knew what the other people were about, and that's the framework where you can achieve negotiation. If you create term limits, I mean, you're going to have a perpetual Tea Party mentality in Washington. Tear everything down. I'm leaving in a couple of years anyway, and you'll have no institutional knowledge, you'll have no relationships, and I think you go from worse to even more terrible. That's my opinion of term limits.
I second that. Let's take another question.
Thank you. You've alluded to some of this over the night and given me some new things to think about. But where is it written that if you're pro-life, you can't be pro-climate, can't be in favor of climate change reform? Or if you want gun control, that you, I don't know, what some other unrelated issue is, that everybody's got to be in the same column on every issue. Is that really an evolution of our time? Is it? I remember way back in history, American history in high school, there was slavery was that you had to be one or the other, and we know what happened there. So is that notion of no cross-cutting allegiance? I don't know.
No, it's a really good question. There's an example that illustrates the answer. There was an environmental movement growing up within the Southern Baptist Convention itself while Obama was president. 2012, 2013. It's a guy who had what was his name? Richard something.
Yes, I've had him on the program. I'm trying to think. It was
Yeah.
about shepherding the earth. It was
Yeah,
based in
yes,
biblical.
Right.
yeah.
It was Old Testament
Yeah.
shepherding the earth, and they were growing. They just got cut off at the knees. They eventually got told, this is not what we're going to do. This is not part of who we are. This is not part of our program. Money is a big part of all this stuff. Money will dry up, and this is true on the left as well as on the right. Actually, but more money is at stake on the right. But if you try to go unorthodox, the donors.
Well, Julian, wouldn't you trace this back to the 60s and 70s, where there were a lot of women, for instance, who felt that they couldn't be part of the women's movement? They felt cut off if they, for instance, felt that abortion was wrong. They felt that they weren't welcome. I mean, I think there's been a lot of that kind of exclusionary politics.
Yeah, I mean, the cover of our book has Phyllis Schlafly, who's a big player in the 70s, and her big issue is the ERA, and she kind of makes an argument, if you're pro-family, you really have to move to the GOP, because this is where the family is, and gradually the party embraces what the activists argued, and it's not written anywhere. It's just written into the way parties are organized and the way party money is donated. But that was an argument. It was kind of a very clear-cut argument. If you are, and it doesn't take hold, it takes a while to take hold. If you are, supportive at all of reproductive rights, you can't really be part of the GOP. And that's part of the phenomenon that we're talking about.
And I have 6 photos in my book, and who's the photo at the beginning of chapter 4?
There she is.
Schlafly.
Yeah.
We're on the same page.
The irony, she embodied the opposite of what she was. She's a very prominent professional activist arguing for traditional family values. I mean, it's kind of a weird story.
Yes.
Question for you guys as historians. Seems to me that one of the more depressing examples of our polarization was Mitch McConnell's decision not to give Merrick Garland a hearing, but just to say, we're going to wait a year. We're just not going to take it up. That strikes me as having been really a stretching of the spirit of the Constitution, if not the actual document. Is that something that we can, are there lots of parallels in American history to that kind of stretching of the Constitution, or is this something that is relatively new and therefore quite frightening, at least to me, I think?
I mean, look, there are moments when what you're talking about is when partisanship allows members of Congress or presidents to stretch either constitutional mechanisms or non-constitutional political processes to their limits, to say, we're going to do whatever it takes to win. And you do have moments like that. So these conservative Southern Democrats and the Republicans used the committee system in the 40s and 50s in ways that really many thought were beyond tolerable. They wouldn't let civil rights even come up for a vote. They wouldn't let Medicare even come up for a vote. John Stennis used to joke that he had pockets made in his coat just to stuff all the civil rights bills that he would never let out of his Senate committee. And that was an example. It wasn't partisanship. It was actually bipartisan conservatism where you saw that. I do think in this period that has accelerated. It's on steroids at this point. Yeah. And I do think this new Republican Party has made a decision, some might support it, that norms, processes are all secondary to kind of partisan victory. And McConnell is the perfect embodiment of this, as is Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan in the House. They have done this repeatedly. It was like the debt ceiling, where you say, well, we'll take a routine vote so the government can keep funding what it said it's going to fund, and we're going to use it as budget leverage. Yeah. Shutdowns. Gingrich kind of opens the door in 96, 95 and 96. We will shut down the government in a budget negotiation. And so that has, I think, accelerated. And Trump does it too. I mean, that is a motif. And it is dangerous. I mean, I can say it happened before. Doesn't mean it's not pretty dangerous because you keep ratcheting up what you're going to do.
We have another question. You come on up, but I just want to ask you guys, we always talk about, how do you think history will view Trump? Do you come across historians who think he will be seen as a bully pulpit Teddy Roosevelt? I mean, do you come across historians anyone who thinks that he will be viewed favorably?
I can't even meet Trump supporters who will say that. Meaning when I do meet Republicans who say, yeah, I voted for Trump, not historians, I haven't met any, but even they don't like what he does, or they say we will survive this and the Republican Party isn't about this, they try to create that distance. But I haven't found many people, other than what I read from the diehards, who really see him that way, as this great fighter who changes the system by tearing it down and brings us something better. Maybe they're out there, certainly not historians.
I just want to go back to the court real quickly. What McConnell did is making the idea of court packing much more mainstream among Democrats. So some of you may have noticed that Pete Buttigieg, who's the Democratic mayor of South Bend, who's a candidate for president, who's probably not going to be the next president of the United States, but is one of the more moderate candidates, said on TV the other night that he would probably endorse court packing. It's probably going to be much more normalized, and boy, the Republicans are going to say that it goes back to Roosevelt, and they're going to raise Robert Bork, but the Garland thing was really, really a tipping point.
A tipping point, but something that had been kind of under the water. There was a documentary like 15 years ago about the attempts, and I think it was Newt Gingrich led to pack the courts, the lower courts first. So it's not. Yeah. It's not new.
Little story for you. Can I? No. Okay. Ask your question. I'm sorry. Go. You go.
Thank you for this conversation. I want to go back to what Robin raised earlier about 1968 and that being the last worst time in American history, and how we reflect to young people about what's happening now. In 1968, as you all pointed out, we had the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement was, coming to a head. And those two things are really easy to point to when you talk to young people about the past. And so I'm trying to think of what can we point to in the past 15 years that has the same immense impact on our country as those two events, and how we ended up where we are today.
Well, yeah, okay, so 15 years rules out 9/11, fair enough. And it rules out Bush v. Gore. Oh, I want to tell this Supreme Court story. This is really like, you gotta know this, okay? I'll be fast. Thurgood Marshall resigned from the court in the summer of 1991. And at that time, there were people who said, what are you doing resigning? Why don't you wait till the next election and see if maybe a Democrat gets elected? But it wasn't the issue back then that it is in our time. You know when Marshall died? Like if he'd stayed on until he passed away, you know when he died? January 25th, 1993. The 5th day of Bill Clinton's presidency. Just think about that. Okay, now, 1968, the last 15 years, well, it would be the Great Recession. It would be the economic meltdown of 2008, I think, which you know, gave rise to the Tea Party, gave rise to Trump, who gave rise, in many ways, gave rise to the kind of right-wing ethno-nationalist populism that we see not just in this country, but in Britain and across Europe. But I'll say one thing about 1968 that's a little bit different before I turn it over to Julian for the last remarks. 1968 was bad in a lot of ways, but you know what else was true in 1968? Like the GDP grew at like 6%. It was the lowest. Does anybody in this room, some of you in this room, know what the Gini coefficient is? The Gini coefficient is a measure of society's economic equality. 1968 was literally the year of the United States' lowest ever. It's like golf. The lower scores, the better. The lowest ever Gini coefficient score that the United States has ever had. So 1968, and third point, the economic report of the president, prepared by the Council of Economic Advisors in 1968, the recurring phrase in that report was the problem of prosperity. Okay? So 1968, bad year in a lot of ways. But in economic terms, 1968 was one of the best years we've ever had, which brings me to my concluding point. Another way out of this mess, and this is how I conclude the book, let's have, again, an economy that produces general prosperity for everybody, and not just the 1%, and not just the 10% or the 12%. We're always going to have these differences and divisions, folks. You know, there are always going to be people who don't like immigrants, and there are always going to be people who don't like gay people, and whatever it is. But if there is a general prosperity and people aren't economically frustrated, the temperature goes way down on all that stuff. That is the job today of the Democratic Party. I mean, the Republican Party's not going to do it. But I'm a little bit hopeful in this respect. We do seem to be turning this corner. Keynesian principles animated the economic policies of this country from the 1930s through the 1970s. Then the things happened that Julian said, and the great inflation, which we haven't talked about really per se, but the inflation of the 70s, I can see that a few of you in this room may remember it. It was pretty harrowing, and it opened the door for a new set of economic theories, which became, of course, supply-side economics. And Keynesianism came under great questioning. Now, we have finally reached a point where that is happening to supply-side principles. And the door is opening to a new set of solutions. If we can yank that door open and again have a country where there is a general economic prosperity, polarization will decrease and these problems will decrease a little.
I'll quickly add two more points that are important. One is, and I'm a little tired, so I'm forgetting these co-sponsor with Markey. This is a boring one, but important, of the climate change legislation when Obama was president. I can't remember who he co-sponsored. There was a real effort to kind of put legislation on the table. There was some bipartisan support. It was kind of the last great moment when Congress almost acted, and it didn't. And I think climate change, we don't think of it as a crisis comparable to civil rights or to Vietnam, but it is. It's this global crisis we are facing.
I think
and,
we do.
And
I think-
it's unclear if we have a political system right now that can react to it. And it's not the kind of thing that's getting better every year. So when that legislation fell apart, kind of the doors closed, and I think that was important, and it's only gotten more severe. And look, the other one for me remains the Charlottesville and the aftermath, because another important story, and I know this is controversial, but kind of how white nationalism has entered into mainstream American politics, and there's someone in the White House who is okay kind of playing in that field. That's different. That isn't Ronald. I mean, Ronald Reagan's controversial, but we have to have scale and scope differences, and it came alive at that moment. It became crystal clear the kind of politics we see in the Oval Office. And so that's a really important moment for me in the last few years.
Look, can I tell a little story, just a tiny little story? Because you mentioned it has nothing to do with anything and the profound things that you've just said. But you mentioned Barney Frank, miss Barney Frank a lot. And I was at an event with him a couple years ago, and I looked out and I had such great memories, because back in the 70s, remember when Barney Frank was dating Kathleen Sullivan, who worked in the do you remember this? Kathleen Sullivan, who worked in the City Hall. She went on to marry Alioto in San Francisco, became Kathleen Alioto. But he was dating Kathleen Sullivan of Sullivan Stadium, the Sullivans who own the Patriots. And I happened to be dating her baby brother, Patrick. And so we would double date. And so we had this fundraiser a couple of years ago for a fabulous organization in Newton called Yes We Can. It's about buying up homes and selling them at really low prices to blue-collar workers and other workers who could live and work in Newton, right? Great organization. And he came to support it, and there he is in the front row. And I looked out, I was so happy to see Barney. He just makes me smile. And I said, Barney, and there's like 500 people there at this fundraiser. And I said, Barney, so great to see you. You know, I just have these memories of in the 70s, and you were dating Kathleen Sullivan, and I was dating her baby brother Patrick, and we would double date. And he yelled out in front of these 500 well-heeled people at this fundraiser, yeah, and today I'd switch. Okay, I thought, please thank our esteemed historians and authors for being here.
Thank you.